Good morning, friends, and welcome to another Sunday as we work our way through the book or the letter of Galatians. Today we are in chapter 5. I hope you've had a chance to read through the verses 1 through to 15. And the theme for today is gospel freedom. Last week we were exploring the theme of gospel family, this idea that we have been given, provided, brought into a new family, and today it's gospel freedom. And it makes a lot of sense, because deep within the human heart is this desire to live in freedom. And we see the themes of freedom and captivity all around us. It's ever since sin has been in the world, we have wanted to be free again. And so it makes sense that we see these same themes of freedom and captivity, not just within the biblical literature, but also within the narrative of our culture as well. And one of the easiest places to have a look to see those themes and to understand those themes is within the movies and literature that has been written. And we see that so often those same themes of freedom and captivity are permeating our wider culture. I was thinking about this last week, and as I was thinking about it, I heard the news of the death of the actor who plays Bilbo Baggins within Lord of the Rings. Now, maybe you haven't watched the movies or even read the books, but it's one of my favourite books to read. I love the movies as well, but I particularly love the books. And this theme of freedom and captivity permeates Tolkien's work in Lord of the Rings. And one of the images that came to my mind as I was thinking about this is an image where Bilbo, who had found the ring as a hobbit, he meets with his nephew Frodo in Elrond's house. And Frodo is on his way to take the ring to Mordor, to destroy it, the one ring to rule them all, the one ring to enslave all of Middle-earth. But in this instance, in this part of the story, Bilbo meets with Frodo, and they're in a smaller room, and Bilbo asks Frodo, "Do you still have the ring? Do you have the ring that I gave you?" And this is what we're told. Bilbo says to him, "Well, I should just like to see it for a moment." When he had dressed, Frodo found that while he slept, the ring had been hung about his neck on a new chain, light but strong. Slowly he drew it out. Bilbo put out his hand, but Frodo quickly drew back the ring. To his distress and amazement, he found that he was no longer looking at Bilbo. A shadow seemed to have fallen between them, and through it he found himself eyeing a little wrinkled creature with a hungry face and bony, groping hands. You see, in Tolkien's work of Lord of the Rings, this one ring, the ring of power, enslaves all hearts to it. And Bilbo is no exception. Even just seeing the ring once more brings out that captivity, that idea that he is enslaved somewhat to the ring and he desires to possess it. He's bound to the ring. And the book's journey is one where we follow that tension between being enslaved to the ring and to its power, and yet trying to thwart it, trying to overthrow it, trying to escape that captivity and live in freedom. What does freedom look like within Middle-earth without the one ring to rule them all? Well, my friends, freedom is something that is placed upon all of our hearts. We all have that desire to live in true freedom. For that is how we were created. We were created back in the Garden of Eden to live in a way that God had intended, to live in freedom. And we find that if we look back then, you see, freedom isn't simply to do whatever we wanted. No, there were still rules and boundaries placed upon us. But those rules and boundaries made sense. It was only natural that we would live in a way that was obedient to God, for that is how we were created. God gave them even some rules. Care for the garden. Take care for it. Look after it. Work hard. Enjoy it as well. For that is what freedom meant. And yet as soon as sin entered into the world, as soon as their eyes were opened to both good and evil, humanity was enslaved. Humanity was held captive. Both in the larger sense of the whole of creation was then tainted, marred if you like, but also in the individual sense that each and every one of us no longer experiences that true freedom, but we are captive, we are enslaved to sin. And so the journey of Jesus and the journey of the gospel is a journey of bringing back true freedom. And just like where we see Bilbo lash out in desiring the ring once more from Frodo, just like we see Bilbo was captive to the power of the ring in that moment, we too so often are held captive to slavery. We too struggle, and it's always so tempting to go back to what was. It's always so tempting to actually think that captivity and slavery is better than freedom. All you have to do is actually have a look at the story of the Israelites to know that that is so true of the human heart. The Israelites had left Egypt. They had been redeemed and rescued by God using Moses, and Moses was leading them in the wilderness. And as they wandered in the wilderness, we find that the Israelites cry out and they say, let's go back to Egypt. Life was better back in slavery. Well, I think that's a picture that is painted for us so that we can understand how tempting it is for each and every one of us to revert back to slavery. How tempting it is for us to falsely believe that captivity is better than freedom. Captivity is better than freedom. At least that is the lie that we tell ourselves, and that is the lie that Satan wants us to believe, my friends. And so we find that although we were created for freedom, created to live in the potential that God had made us, sometimes slavery looks better. Sometimes slavery looks better. And as Paul writes to the church of Galatians, as Paul writes to these new believers who were mostly Gentiles, they didn't mostly come from the Jewish faith, they were mostly Gentiles, and they're wrestling with how to live in a way that honours God. Paul writes to them, and here we find as he speaks into this theme of freedom, encouraging them to live in freedom. He says to them, don't lose or abuse that freedom that has been won for you. Don't lose or abuse that freedom that has been won for you. And really, we find that there it is those two challenges there for the church in Galatia. The challenge where it's possible for them to lose their freedom. It's astonishing to hear that, but that seems to be what Paul says. That there is a possibility, if you like, of that freedom that had been won being lost. But also, secondly, we find that there is the possibility of that freedom being abused also. And so Paul writes to this church, this young church, and says, don't lose or abuse your freedom. So what does it mean for us to be able to lose our freedom? Well, we touched on that last week when Paul was saying, don't fall back into legalism in thinking that there is something that you can do, some way that you can earn your righteousness, your salvation. No, Paul's reminding them here that if they fall into the behavior and the pattern and the temptation into thinking that they are saved by Christ plus something, plus good works, plus obedience, plus whatever, then the temptation or the possibility is that they can lose their freedom. Do not fall into legalism. But equally, there is another danger that Paul brings in now. Do not abuse that freedom. Do not think, do not falsely believe that just because you have been saved, just because you have been declared righteous now, that gives you warrant to live any way you want. No. Rather, Paul says, now that you have been redeemed, now that you have experienced the gospel and the grace of Christ within your life, you ought to live in obedience, not to try to earn your salvation, but because that is the natural way of God's grace working within us. That when we experience the grace of Christ, that our lives are changed. And so, Paul reminds the Galatians here, do not lose your freedom in thinking that you can somehow earn that salvation, earn that righteousness. No, if you try to do that, you actually run the risk of perverting it and losing it. But also do not abuse it. Do not think that now this gives you warrant and license to live any way you want. Not at all. Not at all. That is an abuse of that freedom. But rather, when you set your eyes on Jesus, on Him who has redeemed you, your life will change in such a way that you desire to live for Him and desire to live into that freedom, the way that you were created to live in. So what do we do, my friends, if we find that we are either falling back into legalism or even that we find that we're starting to abuse that freedom? Well, Paul is really clear. Set your eyes upon Jesus. As you gaze upon Him, that will rewire who you are on the inside and what you desire as well. And so as Paul closes this section in his letter to the Galatians, he encourages them, stand firm. Stand firm in the freedom that you have been granted. Secondly, he says to them, continue to run the race. These two metaphors are metaphors that Paul loves to use. Stand firm where you have been planted. Do not be pushed aside. Do not be swayed. Do not fall over. Do not lose that freedom. Stand firm, but also run the race. Run the race. Live into that freedom and finish the race well and as a winner. And he makes it really clear to us that the only thing that counts is faith expressed through love. So if you want to understand what does freedom truly look like, it looks like faith expressed through love. This is how freedom ought to be lived out. The gospel does not compel us to live how we might want or how we might naturally desire, but rather the gospel does something within our hearts such that we understand, that we see that our innate desire is then to live for Him who created us. And so, my friends, as you go about your weeks, my encouragement to you would be, what does it look like this coming week to have your faith expressed through love? What does it look like to lean into that freedom? To not risk losing that freedom in thinking somehow that you've got to do the right things in order to be saved and falling into legalism, but also not abusing that freedom in thinking that you can do whatever you want. But through faith expressed in love, what does it look like as you set your eyes upon Jesus and upon the cross to live for Him?